Hey, this is Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec. I've got John Ham here from J Ham Corp.
Yes.
Yeah, so outstanding. For those that don't know, John's one of the actually very senior SANS instructors. He's been here a long time, does a lot of work here with Security 503, I think, and several other courses, CISSP.
Yeah,
what else
that
do
one
you do?
too. 504, 503, 414, 401, some others.
Man's an absolute security master, and years of absolute years of security experience there. We published a video earlier this week where we talked a lot about ICE subpoenaing a researcher, a breach hunter, who had discovered some ITAR's data, and then published that data. We were actually chatting about this in the instructor lunchroom, and asked John if he'd come on and talk a little bit about some of the follow-up questions that we had regarding some of the ethics and some of the other legal concerns about that. Any thoughts you want to start off on with there?
Well, yeah, when I started thinking about the questions that we have in front of us, honestly, it begged the question for me, just the ethics of the activity of going out and looking into the world to find data that's unprotected or protected not in the way that it should be, or even just published inadvertently or what have you. And it seems like in this case it probably wasn't an AWS bucket out there that was discovered. Now, how it was discovered, I guess, is kind of part of the ethical question for me as well.
Sure.
If something's discovered inadvertently, then what to do about it certainly comes into the realm of ethics in the last couple of questions, I suppose. But the act of going out and looking for it, I don't know, right? I mean,
this is kind of an interesting question because Dave Shackelford, I know you know Dave, right?
Yeah.
One of our SANS faculty. He really is strongly opinionated about this as well, and says, hey, if you're out there hunting open AWS buckets, or whether it's AWS or any platform for that matter, right? Out there hunting for data, he's like, that's I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically, you're just a bad person, right? And sounds like that's kind of where you're at there.
Look, if you find somebody's data flapping in the wind like that, chances are they didn't mean for it to be. They didn't want it to be.
Right.
It seems the ethical thing to do if it's discovered inadvertently is to let them know,
right,
for certain, and hope that they'll take care of that. I mean, if I left my front door not only unlocked but gaping open, I would hope one of my neighbors would come by and either shut it or let me know, hey, you left your door open.
Sure.
That sort of thing. But the going out looking for open doors.
Yeah, no, that is the analogy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going around the neighborhood looking for open doors. And I guess, I can see that there can be some societal value to somebody doing that who has the ethics not to exploit the situation,
right,
but rather to help somebody correct the situation. And I can see the good Samaritan ethics behind that. And if that's what someone's doing, is going around trying to find where people have messed up to help them unmess themselves, then I don't really have any qualms with that. But where it's being posted anonymously in an attempt to shame the victim in a sense, that really is, I mean,
sure,
the victim of the shaming at least, or to shame the person or company that's been lax. I guess I'm not sure the societal advantage to that, other than an individual maybe can build a reputation off of it and get lots of followers on the Twitters. But
certainly that's a motivator, I think, for some people. But can we talk about where that analogy breaks down? Because maybe we don't even touch these questions at all. I'm really interested in your ethical thought here on because where the analogy breaks down for me is that there's no societal value in somebody trying the example of trying the front door to see if one's unlocked.
See if it's unlocked. Yeah.
There's no societal value in some random person walking around checking those doorknobs and then saying, hey, I found John Ham's door unlocked, publishing that information online. And oh, by the way, he left dirty dishes in his sink. I checked, right? Because that's the equivalent of what we're doing, right?
That's just what it feels like.
Yeah,
that's really what it feels like to me.
And it is, right? But I might kind of step back and I'd like to use a different analogy here because I think ours breaks down. Well, this is the one that's most commonly used, right?
Yeah.
But it breaks down here in the sense that a lot of the data that's left unsecured does actually have a public interest, right? The data that we think, at least the subpoena was generated against, actually had to do with the alert database for law enforcement.
And that's where it starts to get a little tricky because there's so much we don't know, but we can infer that if the subpoena came from ICE, then the data that's being reported and potentially accelerated in its exposure. I mean, that's the other thing, that it's accelerating the exposure of this data in some form or fashion if it's being publicized. And maybe it also causes the exposer to stop exposing more rapidly because they react more rapidly, or there's pressure to do so. But I think we can infer that it must be ITAR regulated.
Oh, no question.
Because otherwise ICE wouldn't have standing.
Right.
And apparently he did try to apply to get the subpoena thrown out, and that failed. So some judge someplace had to say, yeah, ICE has jurisdiction to issue the subpoena. So yeah, we're talking about data that has public value for me as an American citizen.
Well, it has to. The fact that it's export controlled, right? At this point, the fact that it's export controlled, I think, answers the question of is it in the public interest?
Yeah, because now it's not a private matter. It's certainly
there's no
matter.
question, right? Yeah. The fact that it is export controlled data, and let's be fair too. This is the equivalent. If I'm going to come up with an analogy here, what I might throw out there is a police officer leaving his gun, his or her gun, in a public park, right?
Yeah.
What you have is data that has or an item, right? And we're going to call the data here the ITAR related or ITAR controlled data. That's it's dangerous. Obviously, it presents a danger. We wouldn't export control that data to specific countries. How much of a danger is another topic for another time. But again, it's been left out here unsecured. In that case, do we want to flip the ethical question on its head and ask, does the researcher not have a duty to notify?
And I would say absolutely, but there's a flaw in that analogy as well.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. If I accidentally discover a law enforcement officer's weapon, then I have absolutely every duty to society to help correct the situation as safely and quickly as I can. It's another thing to go around following law enforcement officers around, hoping they set their weapon down,
right?
So that you can pick it up and say, "Ha ha, Johnny set his weapon over here." So I mean, I still have ethical qualms about the activity of intentionally looking for other people's flaws. Unless, I mean, look, I do pen tests too, right? So there I am looking for flaws, but that's somebody asking me to. That's someone inviting me, paying me, no less, to find out if they have anything like this going on. And that's different. But anytime I see someone doing some sort of research, that's uninvited and unsolicited, I always have a little bit of a heartburn with that.
Well, hey, before we get into these questions, and you're actually bringing up a really good point. I'd like to throw another situation past you, if you don't mind. Obviously, this is coming, out of the blue, but you probably remember, obviously last year WannaCry was a big deal, and before that Eternal Blue was, what drove it was a big deal. When we knew about Eternal Blue and that it was, released for anyone to use, we understood how the double pulsar implant or the double pulsar malware could be seen remotely. Rendition InfoSec, my company, I actually stood the scans up myself. If anybody's coming after anybody, it's me, right? Come after me. But we scanned the whole internet, right?
I know.
And there were people that had real qualms with that then as well. But I want to come back to we used it obviously to protect our customers and say, hey, look, we know that you were infected specifically, but I'll tell you what was really interesting about that data, and we have not, and under legal advice, probably never will make that data set public for probably good reason. But the city of Atlanta, I don't know if you caught this story. The city of Atlanta, of course, got hit with ransomware. And one of their big pushes in the PR was it can happen to anybody. It just happened to happen to us, and our security is good. Well, that's the point where one of my folks, and sad to say, I didn't think about this myself. One of my folks said, "Hey, don't we have that data set from last year? Wouldn't you like to go check that data set and see what the city of Atlanta looked like last year?" And it turns out that they had 5 machines that were compromised last year, right? So we know for sure they had 5 machines infected. So from a public good standpoint, right, we can come back and say, now I'm not necessarily saying that the ends justify the means, right? But there definitely was public value in being able to say, even if it's from a shaming standpoint, to say, look, your government, who you're paying your taxes to, who you entrust with tons of private data, not by choice, but by force, right? But seriously, by force of literally putting you in jail, data that you have to trust your government with, they're not protecting it. And the fact that they're claiming to have protected it is BS, and we can show that more than a year previously. So there's public value in some of this. even if it comes in unintended ways, I could have never predicted that would be a value there, right?
Well, and I saw value. I was following on the Twitters as you were tweeting the numbers that you were seeing from this. So I was definitely following that effort.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm not being completely objective just because of our relationship, but I wasn't mad at you. I was saying, in fact, I think I tweeted, "Thanks, Jake, for banging that drum," because the rest of us are just banging our heads on the table as we're seeing those numbers accumulate as to the number of double pulsar breaches that were detectable.
Well, it's helpful to see the rise and the fall as well, right?
Yeah,
to kind of know when we crested and when we're
And we could bring. I mean, here's what you were doing on steroids. We could look at Shodan.
Certainly,
and say, is that a public good, or because that's a whole lot of information people did not invite to be aggregated in this way. But I find Shodan to be a useful asset,
hugely so.
And so is it doing public good? Absolutely, it is. So I don't know. I think it's an ethical quandary as far as how much of it serves public good and how much of it is self-serving, and if that's the line for ethics in the first place.
We actually thought about before we hit these questions, because I do want to hit these, but we actually thought about at the time, right? Could we or should we release, and specifically about governments, believe it or not, is where we're looking specifically there. Given that the government sits in the public good, should we then be releasing information about the governments, right? Specifically on the U.S. side. To get international law out of it, right? That were breached, and even then we decided ethically that was over the line, right? That scanning was okay, responding to inquiries about the scanning was okay, alerting our customers was okay, randomly publishing about, even if it's a government and it's in the public interest, we decided was over the line ethically. So for whatever that's worth,
and I think that's a fair line to draw.
Yeah.
I mean,
and again, we may have pulled too tight, right? Maybe we should have gone a little further. I don't know. Bottom line, we made the choice, and that's what we stuck with. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's one thing to be able to do, like, say, as Troy Hunt is doing with the massive.
Oh, have I been pwned?
Yeah, have I been pwned?
Totally.
And an API now to be able to check against 500 million known passwords, but it's by hash, and so nothing about an individual is necessarily very exposed. I mean, saying this IP address is pwned with double pulsar, and here's this and 999,000 others. That I agree that would have been over the line. Some use of that data set is probably ethical. Some other uses of it, and just blanket publication would definitely have crossed my line, and I'd have been.
We had to look at the greater good. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Obviously, there's some wiggle room in all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe that's something that viewers should take away here, right? You've got two folks here with multiple decades of experience in information security, and here we are hemming and hawing about where is the ethical line, and neither of us are stepping up to the plate and saying, exactly right here is the line, right?
The bright line.
It's not there, right? There's a range of, and I think that we see a lot of this in InfoSec, right? And again, if you're in InfoSec today and you're not thinking about the ethics of what you're doing, I think that maybe there's I think that's a gap, right? We do gap assessments all the time. Here's a gap assessment for you. That's a gap, I think, in your thinking. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So do you want to start at the top of the list?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, so there were 8 specific scenarios that somebody posted here. The first one talks about basically what the researcher did, and is ethically right or wrong. The researcher extracts and republishes the data, and I think for the ease of discussion here, I think we're going to say that we're going to take the ethical question out about how the researcher found the data, right? The researcher found it because incidental, whatever, they weren't actively searching for it. We want to cut that piece off so that we can address the more specific question here.
What do you do then?
Yeah, what do you do then? Exactly, right? Yeah. So they extract and republish the data. And let's keep the ITAR-controlled data because, again, there's no question about the value of the data and the sensitivity of the data.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, and the other thing I want to say right up front is we got to keep the legality out of it. I mean, I'm not a lawyer.
Me either.
I know you're not. I know I'm not. I am fairly well apprised of legal issues over more than 20 years of doing this. But it's hard sometimes to separate the legality from the ethics because it is just flat breaking the law unethical, right? And here we can say if that was ITAR data and it was published globally,
There's no question that the law was violated. The letter of the law was violated. There's no question.
Otherwise a judge wouldn't have allowed the subpoena.
Yeah,
So
no question.
So I guess we'll just have to also put on the shelf what are your feelings about the ethics of legal violations? Just the violating the law, is it ethical or unethical? Can it be ethical? Can it, let's set that aside.
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So this extracting and republishing the data, that's beyond my line.
I think so too, but I think one of the things that we chatted about in the lunchroom earlier this week, and I kind of like to get your opinion on, is I'd like to know, do you know whether or not, like if I look at a data set and I go to republish this data set, do I know it's ITAR controlled data?
Yeah, I saw you talking about that on the previous YouTube. The answer is no. I wouldn't. I can't know. I mean, I could easily come across I could come across stuff that's classified and not be able to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's not portion marked, how would you know, right?
That's a quandary also. If the researcher doesn't realize what they're extracting and republishing is a legal violation in so doing, that it's classified, that it's controlled, data in that sense, then maybe I'm a little softer on it,
But doesn't that bring up a bigger question of if we agree that you can't know, how safe are you publishing any data set?
Exactly, which is why I think that just crosses my line.
I like
extracting and republishing somebody else's data, at a minimum, it's a copyright violation. Come on, right? Republishing
I would
anything.
assert you're probably correct.
Yeah,
right?
And so going on to the second one, publishing a link to the original.
Yeah.
That still seems a little mean to me, because if the one thing that is clear to the researcher is that the owner of this data does not mean for it to be publicly accessible.
Ooh, I like that train of thought.
That much the researcher can know. What the data is and whether it's sensitive is one thing. But if it's painfully obvious to the researcher that it was not intended to be made public,
right,
and that it was by error that was done, then I think publishing the link to it is I don't dig that either. I mean, I don't care how you came to the knowledge that my front door is unlocked.
Right.
But don't go put a yard sign pointing at my door saying this door is unlocked.
I love that analogy. That's beautiful, right?
Tell me about it. That's fine, right. And so I can lock the door. That's still neighborly and a public good, but pointing the world to the fact that my door is unlocked and just saying, oh well, whatever happens until they figure it out and lock the door. That to me is it's not the appropriate way to handle it. It's not a responsible disclosure.
Well, that's the exact reason that we didn't republish our double pulsar scans. We recognized that at the time that we did it, these are people that hadn't patched for almost a month and a half, even with a critical exploit or critical vulnerability with public exploit in the wild. And we said, look, this is going to cause additional. It wasn't a shaming issue. It was going to cause additional victimization.
You'd be posting a list of over 100,000 vulnerable systems.
That's it. And some number of which have patched since, but we know probably not many.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah.
And so that to me, that's also crossing the line. The next one,
tag number 3, let's do this. Yeah,
publishes the existence of the data and mentions the general hosting source.
So I picture here that they say, for instance, I found the alert database in an unsecured S3 bucket from this company name, right? I mean, whoever manages the alert database.
But don't point to actually where.
But don't actually point to the link. So I'll give you, while you're thinking about this, I'll weigh in on kind of my thought here.
You go first on this one. I went first on the other two.
My thought on this is that I think it depends on the amount of information that you're publishing about the hosting source itself, right? My question there is, from an ethical, less than ethical standpoint, and by the way, I want to clarify that everything that we're talking about here, these are not definitive judgments. Just use these in building your own ethical, right? We're not lawyers. We kind of covered all that, and law and ethics are separate anyway. But I think here, if there's enough information for a similarly skilled researcher to reverse engineer the source of, right, the source of the data, then I think the answer is no. It's not ethical anymore.
Yeah, it's essentially number 2, but with the number 2 being publishing the link to the original data. It's essentially that, but to a more limited audience of those with similar skills to be able to go and find it. But it's still that, right?
I think it is. Again, if you publish enough information, if you simply say I found this unsecured, I think maybe that's not enough. I think if you say S3 bucket from this company, I think that's probably enough in many cases for a lot of similarly skilled researchers to go find it.
Yeah. So I think from this, I think I can find my line. I think I can. I think for a researcher in that situation, again, leaving aside how they found the information, leaving aside whether or not they can deem its sensitivity, right, the classification of it, and the volume of it, but knowing that it's a relatively severe exposure.
Yep.
And particularly if it's a government entity, a public entity that owes fealty to society in a way that a business may not, I guess my feeling of responsibility would be first disclosure to the entity who's responsible for the exposure.
Certainly.
I mean, certainly you have to let them know first, and then if you feel like it's in the public good to let the public know that this exposure had existed.
Yep.
I think at that point, some characterization of the data, but not necessarily exactly what it was.
Right.
Whether maybe it was sensitive. I mean, some characterization that's not damaging to society and not going to be damaging to that public agency, because that's my public agency, and I don't need it damaged in any way. Even some modicum amount of reputational damage by at least announcing this is the agency that was exposing data that I would characterize thusly. They've been contacted about the exposure, and I think that goes far enough to be able to get the societal good of notification. Without causing damage to the
so there's
to the company that made a mistake,
and there's a reparable harm, right? And I think there's an ethical line. I think a lot of that depends on what do you believe the outcome is going to be, and what's your intent, right? Are you trying to deliver a little jolt, or are we talking about some irreparable career-ending harm?
Well, right? and see in that case, and then that could take us back to the subpoena. In that case, you wouldn't be scared of a subpoena. I mean, probably. I'm not to say I would ever want that. I'm just saying, if you do what I just described, which is public disclosure of an observable exposure of data by a public agency, you haven't crossed any lines there. Now we're back within the range of legality.
Agree.
And yet you can claim to have done public good. Now, as a researcher, you could say, but anyone could make any claim, and without providing evidence of it, then I'm just going to look like some yahoo making pointing fingers and making unverifiable claims.
I mean, there is some of that, but I think that's so that's actually a really interesting question, right? Because I think really we come into there's another one here, number 5, a fictional example, right? Where you say, hey, I'm gonna and you could scratch fictional and you could call it redacted or what have you, but some sample data that's representative of the type of data that helps us understand the type of the exposure without actually getting into the data itself. I can see that garnering a lot of fire from inside the tent, right? From inside the InfoSec community, saying, "Hey, why not the real data? What are you doing here? Don't you trust us?" Or,
right.
What do you think there? Is that a?
I think publishing any of the real data, if the data is sensitive, publishing somebody else's sensitive data is just that's across my line. It is. Even if it's the only evidence that you can produce to verify, to validate your claim of having detected that exposure, that it existed, and perhaps escrowing some proof yourself.
Yes.
And as you did with the double pulsar list, escrowing your own, having your own proof that the exposure existed, whether from screenshots to data shots, to data excerpts, whatever, and responsibly escrowing that yourself, so that if there, God forbid, if there was ever any court or any argument over it, court proceedings or any other argument over it, you have at least in your pocket the ability to prove it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you publish that evidence in a way that could be damaging to the organization that was responsible for the exposure. As I just think that's making a victim
Totally
out of an entity that maybe made a mistake.
Yeah, totally. Now, can I throw a monkey wrench in here? For
Oh,
you, right?
absolutely.
Because
you know how I like monkey wrenches.
So as we're discussing this, right? I'm hearing like the okay to publish the fictional data with so that others can make a characterization of it. Let's say I do that, right? And I intentionally am not publishing the original data. I'm not publishing a link to the data. I'm saying this organization had a breach, right? The data is in the public interest. I want to go ahead and capitulate that. The data is in the public interest. We'll check that box, so that's not a concern.
Sure.
And I publish some fictional data, and the organization comes back and says, no, categorically, they publish and say, no, you're full of it. Didn't happen, not happening, right? This is a total lie. What do you do then? Does that change the ethical equation?
That's a fun monkey wrench, isn't it? Because that's certain. I mean, that's
personally,
that's
I know how I want to react. It is predictable, totally.
It's predictable. I know how I want to respond is to immediately publish.
Be like, there you go, buddy. Right? But what does that change? But from an ethical standpoint, right? Taking our personal feel or
it's
our
a bit of ethical
whatever,
right? It's a bit of ethical tit for tat.
I think it is actually.
I mean, if the organization having been notified and then that amount of publication happening, if they come back and categorically deny something that you have hard, solid proof of, in order to stave off the PR, I think I would probably be inclined if I was solid on the evidence. I knew it. I knew it. I knew I could prove it. Like as in prove it in court kind of prove it.
Totally.
If I had it that solid and that happened, I guess I would lock horns publicly and just say you need to retract this categorical denial. Or I will, or I will publish evidence, and I'll do it through, through journalistic, through someone with journalistic integrity, and make sure that it goes into the public record. That as to what's happened.
Sure, and I kind of like that. That's an interesting point. Let me throw one more, just kind of one more counterpoint, or get your thought on. What do you think about in a scenario like that, rather than going back and saying, if you continue down this road, I'm going to publish that data. Does that not invite them to take some legal action / get an injunction? Are you better off than once they've thrown the first salvo, knowing that a potential injunction may come? Right, because they do. Right.
Yeah, they could. Absolutely.
I've been through some of this myself with some security research. I have a couple of cease and desists and some other various legal memorabilia. Right. And so do you then? Do you maybe communicate with a journalist first under embargo ahead of? I mean, like, how do you do? I'm kind of curious what you think about that. And if that's too much, then
I know we're trying to talk about the ethics behind it, but I know what I would do.
Oh yeah, brother, you and me both.
Me and my attorney would be having a nice lunch.
Absolutely. Look, my attorney loves to hear about stuff.
I know. Right? So does mine.
Because he's like billable hours and fun.
Shane, if you're out there,
and fun cases, no less. Right. I mean, that's one of the things that my lawyer recently, last year, end of last year, he said he's like, man. He's like, I never get a call from you guys when it's something pedestrian. I'm like, of course not. We've pretty much got that covered, right? It's the crazy complex. Is there case law on this? Please tell us there's case law on this kind of thing. We don't want to be the case law.
I would. That's that on that question. I would absolutely consult my attorney immediately.
That seems like the best advice we could close that close that one out with. But realize, right? If you make the threat, the threat of if you say, hey, tit for tat, if you don't back down, I'm not going to back down either. We're going to publish this. Just be aware that an injunction is probably forthcoming, right?
And I guess this brings us back around to the initial thing, which is, are you going to go looking for this stuff? I mean, because if you discover it accidentally, you've stepped into something that now you maybe have to seek legal advice about. But if you're going out looking for this stuff,
Yeah.
you're inviting the scenario that we just
you
were
absolutely
discussing.
are.
You're absolutely
Yeah.
inviting it.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking you're going to hide behind a Twitter handle while doing this, then it's
I
going to
think that
successfully.
subpoena shows otherwise,
Yeah, I think.
doesn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing. So
Yeah.
I guess if you're going to engage in that activity as a hobby, or I mean, I don't know how you make a living.
Yeah.
Looking for people's dirty laundry without their invitation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the whole motivation behind it could be a whole other.
I don't know, but if that's your hobby, you might as well do it with your real name.
Yeah, that's truth,
you
man.
might as well do it with your real name.
Yeah, save them a couple of steps, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this. It was, kind of hitting 7 and 8 here. I know we're kind of skipping 6, but I don't know how that differs really from 5, other than, I mean,
number 6,
publishing
your findings without any evidence and without saying who and what. Well, just
what are you saying then? I found a breach.
That's like I can do that in 280 characters.
I found a breach. I mean, sorry. No more data. Sorry. I don't. I'm not sure what the meaning
I have
of that
also
was.
found a breach.
Yeah, many actually. But yeah, I don't know what that one is.
That doesn't help.
But 7 and 8 talk about legally and ethically here. 7 legally, 8 ethically. Researcher discovers data in violation, right? And I'm not sure specifically what this means. We're answering some questions off the Twitter sphere here, but it says in violation. I'm going to go ahead and say here that just to make the ethical, since we're talking ethics, right, to throw some ethical monkey wrench in, let's say that this is HIPAA data, right?
Sure.
And it's, or PHI, right, protected data under HIPAA or high tech. And let's say that data, you discover that the data was unsecured. And you have, let's even capitulate that you have web service logs that you were able to access that show that many other people access this data. Under HIPAA high tech, this is definitely a reportable breach.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And now you also know about the breach. How do you handle that? Right? The company does nothing. You publicly you basically go to the company.
Well, but I didn't read that in here, that you go to the company. I read number 7 and 8 as does nothing. Just I see nothing. I'm not.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting
thing. That's the way I read that. It does nothing.
Well, let's.
I mean, if it said notifies the company and they do nothing, what do you do? That's a different question. But
I read extra things into the question. Okay.
You discover data as a researcher with sufficient knowledge to know that you've discovered exposed data.
Yep.
That it must have been exposed in violation of HIPAA or what have you. That you can easily recognize that. Do you have a legal or ethical responsibility to do something?
Yes.
That's the way I read it.
Okay, and I like this. That's actually a better question to address than the one I was going after. Let's do those.
So, because they literally read it does nothing. Well, I'd say I can't speak to the legality. I'm not an attorney, and I don't know if there's some equivalent of a Good Samaritan law somewhere on the books anywhere, someplace about cyber breaches. But
right.
I fairly suspect not. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
But from an ethical perspective, you got a responsibility to tell somebody. I mean, if you're seeing a violation like that, I do believe that you've got a responsibility to notify the company that's exposing the data. And then, of course, then we can get into the what if they don't do anything. But I think you have that responsibility. Now, when we start looking at the squelching effect the DMCA had,
oh yeah, my goodness,
can you be scared to even go to the company and say, hey, I just found a bunch of your protected data exposed in violation of HIPAA or whatever. Here's what I found. Here's where I found it. How I found it, and you need to do something about it. Now, if you're afraid that in doing so they'll turn around and pursue you under the DMCA, well, that's another concern. God forbid, a CFA. But I mean, that's kind of a hunting expedition in that scenario.
Yeah.
But not that it couldn't happen.
I think we're seeing a lot of hunting expeditions right now under CFA.
I guess if you ever have a quandary like that and you're really scared of it, drop a line to the EFF and ask them. There's some free advice.
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain that Kurt and other folks there would be happy to give you advice as to what to do for responsible disclosure.
That's kind of their bread and butter.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you're not in that scenario, you could just go ahead and send them some money instead of an email, because I'm sure they could use that.
Absolutely.
All right, so. I think that's where I would start with the problem. If you're in a quandary as to how to do something without exposing yourself, then there's a way to do it. But I don't think if you're an ethical and responsible researcher in our field, I don't think you can just do nothing.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there. I mean, I would, if I found that data, I would absolutely then notify. And again, I'm going to take out the how I found or why I found or any of that. I would absolutely notify that organization, right? The follow up is right, and again, there's lots of ways. I'll give you a non. Take the ethical, how did I find the data out of it? I run a security ops center. Rendition runs a security ops center 24/7 in Georgia, right? We routinely, in monitoring our customers, find other third parties that have been breached, right?
Of course you do.
That they're pivoting through their networks
Sure.
to target us. A lot of them
I mean, you don't even
actually,
need a security ops center to do
well,
that.
truth,
You could be
brother,
doing a
tell me
pen
about
test.
it.
I mean,
Yeah,
obviously
totally. And
this
this
happens
happens
during
us
a pen test.
too.
You
Sure.
find out that you're not the only ones there.
Yeah.
Of course.
But in that case, they're actually one of my customers, right? So I would take the pen test, and I would use that example, except this one is the disinterested third party. It's somebody who's attacking one of my customers versus I found it at a customer site. Because I have other legal obligations because of our contractual relationships, NDAs, et cetera.
Sure, but you're finding that somebody else is a victim because they're the pivot point that's through which they're coming.
Absolutely, right? So here we've discovered that, right? Let's say that I then report that, I report it to that company, obviously, because I feel at that point I have an ethical responsibility to do so.
Absolutely.
Right? And so let's say we report it. Let's say that company is a hospital, for instance, has protected health information, and you're casually checking, Office of Civil Rights website a couple of months later, find out they haven't disclosed the breach, right? They had a breach. You suspect highly suspect it involves HIPAA, right? HIPAA data, right? And they haven't disclosed anything, right? What do you do then? Because this is a really interesting case here, because you have potentially, let's say, thousands, tens of thousands, millions potentially of patient records exposed. There's a public good there.
Well,
on the flip side, right? You don't necessarily know that those were exposed, even though you have a high index of suspicion.
Well, this is a lot like back to the one we were in, where hopefully you've kept and properly preserved sufficient evidence to be able to demonstrate, even in court if necessary, that the exposure actually did exist.
Yeah.
Because at some point, I think that now you've got to maybe you didn't go looking for the lack of notification, but you discover the lack of notification. I guess again, I feel like you got a responsibility as a researcher to escalate.
Yeah.
And take it up chain, because.
I would say talk to your employer though too, right? I mean, this isn't a decision you make on your own. Of course, John and I are both we both own our own companies.
Yeah,
that's
why I don't have an employer to talk to. But that's why I talk to my attorney instead.
Yeah, of course. No, you and me both, right? But if you are, before we close this out here, make sure that you understand that we are talking from being the employers and the researcher standpoint, right? If you are 1099 to somebody else, where you're doing contract work for them, talk to them. If you are a regular W-2 employee someplace, that's your employer making this decision, not you, obviously, right? It's their, at the end of the day, if you read your employment contracts, most often it's their data, not yours. And anyway,
absolutely.
Their decision, not yours too. But alas,
and then your responsibility is to decide if you like their decision well enough to keep working for them.
Isn't that now? I think that's an easier decision to make, right? I mean, if you've got an employer who's consistently making decisions that don't line up with your ethical values, I think that's an easy decision.
Yeah,
that's probably the easiest thing we could talk about. Yeah. Well, even that's a great point. Even a client, right? Yeah. I mean, if you and man,
I have fired clients.
Oh, so we were actually talking about that earlier this week. Yeah, totally. Yeah, right. And so and that's a tough thing to do, but it's something that
I sleep better.
Yeah. Oh, you and me both, brother. You and me both, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, hey, I think this is probably a great spot to cut it off. I think we could probably talk another hour on ethics.
I think we may end up.
Well, this is that point too, right? And I think there's probably this may be worth a follow up at another event, maybe to kick some other ethics. Because I mean, I love the point of view. You thought of some stuff I didn't in there, which is just why I wanted to get you on camera after the chats we had. But this is a good spot to close it off. Again, John, I really appreciate you coming out and coming out. I guess we were both in London together, but appreciate you taking some time aside.
No, I came here for this. I flew over here.
Yeah, of course.
I flew over here to be on this video. You see.
Well, about a topic that we didn't know about prior to coming to.
I predicted it.
You predicted it. Yeah. Hire this guy because he's predicting ICE subpoenaing researchers for stuff we didn't know about.
Yeah.
Anyway,
tune in for my next prediction next time.
Yeah, really. So hey, seriously, appreciate you coming out. If you guys are looking for somebody who's awesome in networking, as well as pen testing, auditing, etc., JHAM Corp, definitely someone to talk to.
Thank you very much.
And follow him on Twitter because he's awesome. And I guess it's a good spot to close it off. Jake Williams for Rendition InfoSec, signing off.
Thank you very much.